So what I'd like to talk about is not visual perception, but very related to that, because, of course, visual perception, which many people here are studying, ends with figuring out the meaning of the thing that we're looking at and also representing that. So along with a number of people, we've been looking for the last years at the question of how neural activity encodes really meanings of words and, well, let's say word meanings. And when I say other people, I mean a collection of people. And I put some red boxes around the people who are in this very room. So Gus and Layla and Alana are here and are largely responsible for the work here. So as I mentioned, we're interested in the question of how neural activity codes word meaning. And so we've been doing a number of brain imaging studies with primarily FMRI, but more recently MEG, where we present these kinds of stimuli to people, sometimes line drawings, sometimes written words, sometimes line drawings with written words under them. They're always consistent. And sometimes spoken words. And in an fMRI scanner, then, if we show somebody, let's say, a stimulus like this bottle line drawing with the word bottle written under it, then we observe fMRI activation like this. These are four slices of a three-dimensional fMRI image. Posterior is up, so most of that red activation is in visual areas. And if you ask me, well, what's the difference between what we see when we present bottle and your average word? Well, here's the mean activation that we observe across 60 different stimuli, which looks a lot like the activation for bottle. But there is a difference. And so, in fact, you can see the residue here. If we subtract the mean activation out of what we see for bottle, there is some difference. And many people have used fMRI and various kinds of classifiers to show that, indeed, fMRI activation does allow us to distinguish different categories of pictures and words and so forth. So we're particularly interested in coming up with some kind of computational model that would require us to understand something about the structure of these representations. And so, for example, we'd like a computational model where we could give as input an arbitrary word, actually for now an arbitrary concrete noun in English, like celery. And then if the model really captured something about how these neural representations work, it would be able to predict the fMRI activation when we show somebody that word. So we're interested in that, and this the approach that we're taking actually ties into this theme of latent representations, abstract representations that Jim talked about, Jack talked about, a number of others. And the model that we developed first, if you think about trying to build such a computational model, really the first question you have is, well, how would I represent the meaning of an arbitrary word like celery in a way that would be computer manipulable so that we could train something to predict the fMRI activation? And the first approach that we took was to steal an idea from computational linguistics, which is that you can represent in a computer an approximation to the meaning of a word by capturing statistics of how that word is used in a very large collection of text. So our first model, in fact, used statistics from a trillion-word corpus of text, which Google collected from the web. And given an arbitrary word like celery, it would represent celery as a collection of 25 features, each feature corresponding to some verb. You see here, for example, the verb eat co-occurs a lot with celery. Taste occurs a fair number of times. Ride occurs very rarely with celery. So we had a collection of 25 verbs, which, well, to be honest, I made up, but involved a lot of sensory motor type verbs. And you can see for a different word like airplane, we get a very different profile of statistics. And you'd have to agree with me that these statistics capture some aspects of the meaning of the word. Okay, so given that, our model then could be trained. We'll use that feature vector of co-occurrence statistics as our representation of the stimulus. And then we can train a regression model to predict, say, what the FMRI activation will be for a word like celery by taking those 0.84 co-occurrence with eat and training essentially a voxel by voxel regression model to predict at each location in the brain what the activation will be as a function of how frequently our input noun stimulus co-occurs with each of these 25 verbs. And you can see that if we had some training data, collection of nouns and known FMRI images for those nouns, then we could look up these verb co-occurrences as properties of the stimulus, train this large regression model, and indeed that's what we did. So in the end, the prediction at each voxel v is just the sum over 25 features. Each feature is the frequency of the stimulus word with verb I, eat, taste, etc., times some coefficient that tells how much that particular feature contributes to voxel I, or to voxel v. Okay, so a standard linear regression, really. There are a lot of parameters in this model. We're not afraid of training models with more parameters than we have training examples. One thing that makes this work well is that if you think about it, there are 20,000 voxels here approximately. So we're training 20,000 different independent linear regressions. So the number of parameters per linear regression is much smaller. And anyway, between that and some significant regularization, you can make this work. So don't believe anybody who tells you you can't train useful models if you don't have more data points than you have features. Okay, so now does this work? In fact, here, if we train on a collection of other words and then present the novel to the model, words celery and airplane, you see the predicted images and the observed images. You see they're not perfectly correct predictions, but they capture some of the structure that's going on here. And by the way, this blue streak is basically fusiform region. Okay, so that's one way I can show you what the model does. Another way is more quantitatively. We can just measure how accurate would this model be if we were to give it pairs of words that it was not trained on. Say we didn't train it on celery and airplane. And we give it the pair of fMRI images that go with those two, that come from those two words. And then we ask it which one is celery and which one is airplane. So if it's guessing at chance, it'll get half of those correct by chance. Given the number of examples we have to be statistically significantly above chance, we need a little better than 0.5. And in fact, when we try this, train the model independently on 9 different subjects in the experiment, then it does significantly better than chance. So 3 times out of 4, if you give it a pair of words it hasn't seen, it can match that up with the 2 fMRI images it hasn't seen. Okay, so there's a quantitative way of measuring how well a model is doing. Okay, so another way of looking at this model and seeing how much we like it is to ask, what are the loadings? What are those learned coefficient sets for each of those verbs, for each of those 25 verbs? So for example, here is, let's take the verb eat. These are the learned coefficients from the training data. And remember, we never gave a verb as a stimulus. We never gave eat as a stimulus in the training set. We only gave nouns. The system indirectly solved for this collection of coefficients that basically represent the activation that will be contributed to the final prediction as a function of how frequently the noun stimulus co-occurs with eat. And so what this is telling us is if we have a noun that occurs a lot with the verb eat, we'll see a lot of activation here, which some people have previously referred to as gustatory cortex. It's involved in the sense of taste. Another verb, push, gives us a collection of a burst of activation in somatosensory regions. So for about half, not all, of those 25 verbs in the model, if you look through the learned coefficients, you see some interesting correspondence between what we think of as the meaning of the verb, the activations, and the activations being predicted in regions that are cortical regions associated with that action. So this is very consistent with what a number of other people had pointed out, that much of the representation, neural representation that we see for word meanings is grounded in sensory motor regions. So this is just another way of observing that. Okay, so there's the model. And one thing I want to point out is that this is pretty much analogous to the story that you heard earlier from Jack. So Jack had a similar kind of story to tell us, where essentially he said, I have some stimuli, a time series movie. I'd like to predict the sequence of images, and I'm going to come up with some abstraction that's going to mediate between the stimuli and the observed fMRI data so that I can train a model. And just like us, he came up with a set of features that represent the stimulus, that are computable from the stimulus, in his case with a visual processing algorithm and from some hand labeling. That included edges, regions, and so forth. And then given that essentially feature vector, it wasn't our 25 verbs, it was a much more subtle, rich set of features, we also heard that he used large-scale regression to make that prediction. So I just wanted to kind of highlight this correspondence between some of the other things we've been hearing here. So back to the main story, though. So here's our model. Now, the first thing you might ask about this model is those 25 verbs, why? Right? If you think about it, what this model is essentially saying is we can predict neural activity when somebody thinks about a word based on how it's used on the web, and in particular, in terms of co-occurrence with these specific 25 verbs. And that can't possibly be the optimal model for predicting neural representations. So we got interested in what would be a better model, or what would be a better set of semantic features to characterize the stimulus. So we started exploring that in a number of ways. We had a lot of friends who had suggestions about what kind of features we should use instead. Try more verbs. Try all the words in English. So we tried a number of these, but it didn't actually improve our cross-validated model accuracy. And then one day, Dean Pomerleau, who is part of this research project, came in and said, I found something that works better. And what he had done is come up with a set of 218 questions, very similar to the ones that you would think of if you were playing 20 questions. And he had gone to Amazon's Mechanical Turk service. He had gotten people there to answer these 218 questions for 1,000 common nouns in English. And when he used the answers to these questions, obtained behaviorally from Mechanical Turk workers, he finally came up with a model that beat our corpus statistics. So in some sense, this is a better, more accurate basis set of features for mediating between words and their neural representations observable by fMRI. Okay, then fortunately, Indra Rastandi, one of our PhD students, came up with an even better model. And it was actually based on the same Mechanical Turk-derived features. But Indra said, well, this is fundamentally a machine learning problem. What we want to do is we want to find the definition of a set of features that will give us the most accurate system. And he came up with the following model, which I want to show you. So unlike the first model, this model is trained using data from multiple subjects. not on a subject-specific basis. And also, unlike the model that I talked about before, the overall model includes both subject-specific parameters that are being estimated differently for each individual person, and then subject-independent parameters that are also being estimated. So I'll show you the model, but basically he comes up with a set of features that we'll characterize that are going to mediate between the stimulus features and the data in a three-step algorithm. So in step one, he uses canonical correlation analysis, which is a technique which, like PCA, can give you abstractions of data, or like what Jim talked about earlier, can give you abstractions of data. In particular, what CCA does is it finds a collection of features. The first one it finds is the feature that it learns a linear mapping, a linear function that maps from each data set to define the feature as a linear combination of the voxel intensities. But it learns one for each data set, and it learns that collection of linear mappings so that they have the following property. The projected points according to that linear mapping have the maximum correlation possible among linear mappings. So basically, they're looking for linear mappings from each of these 20 different data sets to points that will be maximally correlated across the 60 stimulus words that we were using. And then given that, it finds a second component, which is also the next most correlated feature, subject to being uncorrelated with the first feature. And it goes on. So you can think of it as filling the same kind of role that Jim was talking about this morning when he was telling us about how to combine data across multiple subjects using rotations, parameterized rotations for each different data set, plus PCA. And those two things done in sequence, he showed us how those could also give a lower dimensional representation of the data, along with essentially a linear function that was the composition of two linear functions to get to that abstraction. So I think part of the theme that's emerging from this meeting is a lot of interest and ideas about the importance of coming up with subject-independent representations of data that take into account the kinds of variation that we see across the stimuli that are being provided. Okay, so back to Indra's approach. So Indra does that. He happens to use CCA instead of the approach we've heard about before. But then in a second step, he links up these features that were derived from the FMRI variations to the stimuli. How? Well, we have these 218 mechanical Turk features, so let's just learn a linear regression to predict each of these factor loadings, or sorry, each of these values for each of the subjects. Okay. And so this ends up being, these parameters essentially say we can predict each of these features, which are subject independent. These parameters are subject independent. And then given those subject independent characterizations of, well, they came out of the FMRI data, didn't they? But now they're being actually predicted from the stimuli. Then we could just go ahead, we'd have to invert this arrow, which is the third step of his algorithm. So he just inverts these matrices that we got out of CCA. You have to use a pseudo-inverse because there are many inverses. And so we regularize and pick one that minimizes the weight scores, essentially. So now we end up with this feed-forward model that does what we want. And it starts with the stimulus, codes it by a lookup of these behaviorally obtained semantic features, goes through this intermediate abstraction, which is subject independent, and then maps in a subject-specific way to each data set. And this is the model that we have that gives us the best results. This got us up to 86% in that, distinguishing two novel words and matching them up with the novel images. And so And, well, so let me just ask then the same question that I think I asked of one of the speakers. What are the meanings of these features that get discovered? So we can look at that in, of course, two ways. One, just as Jack was talking about earlier, we could ask for, let's say, the first CCA component. What are the stimulus words that most excite that CCA component according to our learned regression? And so for component 1, out of the 60 words, here are the top 5 that most excite component 1 as stimuli. Here are the ones for component 2 and so forth. I'm not sure how to name them, but maybe I would call this one shelter. These are things I can go in inside and hide. Maybe I would call this one stuff I can manipulate. I don't know what to call the third one. Weird collection of stuff. Okay, but that's one way of looking at these components. Another is to ask, well, what are the feature loadings, just as Jim was showing us in his talk. So here is a three-dimensional FMRI image of loadings for that first CCA component. And I didn't, it was on the slide, but I didn't point this out, but it's important. A detail of these, there were 20 data sets that we were working with at the time. Half of those data sets involved people getting word-only stimuli, printed text words. The other half of the data sets involved people getting line drawings with words underneath them. One of the subjects was a subject in both of those experiments. So what I want to show you is the loadings for this factor for that subject. And as it says at the top of the slide, this is for the word-only stimuli session that the subject provided. And again, this is posterior, anterior. And so you see these are the loadings for that shelter-style component. When the person was involved, saw the stimulus only as a word. Now let me show you what happens when we switch to the other data set where he saw the stimulus as a word with a line drawing accompanying it. So what do you think happens? That's what happens. So we get a lot more activation in posterior regions. Probably that's not a big surprise to this crowd. But if you look at what happens when I toggle back and forth, except for those posterior regions, the neural representations, or the codes, are actually quite similar across the two. So it's sort of like it didn't matter whether it was a word or a word accompanied by a line drawing as long as you were only looking from here forward. And if you're looking behind there, then it actually mattered. That's an oversimplification, but if you look at this for a while, you'll see that's remarkably true. So this model, as we mentioned, used a collection of data sets to learn an abstraction and then learned separately in a separate stage a mapping from our stimulus to those so that we could make it into a full model. We did this again a different way. Instead of using CCA, we used factor analysis. And I want to show you the results of that because we also tried an interesting little experiment there. Remember when I said I don't know quite what to call this component, but maybe it's shelter? Well, we did this again with factor analysis. We only used the words-only stimulus data, so there were no line drawings or pictures involved in this stimulus set. And when we did it, we got the following 4 top components that came out of the factor analysis. And each of these components is shown here in terms of what regions in the brain it corresponded to, and also, as before, which are the words that most, stimulus words that most excite that component in the final model. And so again, we have this one that you might call shelter, you might call manipulation, you might call eating, and that we're pretty sure is word length, this fourth one. But, and this model works pretty well. But the interesting thing is This number, the 80% accuracy number, comes from the following way of testing the model. Given two novel words to it, we had the FMRI data, but we withheld it during training. Instead of predicting with linear regression the values of these loadings, we actually just behaviorally asked people, an independent collection of people, to go through the 60 words and label them on a scale from 1 to 7 according to how much they made them think of shelter, manipulation, and eating. And we used those behavioral ratings instead of the regression predictions. Why? So that we could test whether our intuitions about the meanings of these components jive with what people think of when they behaviorally just look at the words and think about, well, is this about eating or not? And in fact, those behavioral ratings are shown here on the vertical axis for each of the 60 words. And the factor scores assigned by our model are shown on the horizontal axis. And so you can see for each of them the correlation between the model-derived factor scores for these components and the behaviorally obtained assessments about how those 60 different words, how much they make you think about manipulation, for example. And here you can also see that fourth component. We didn't ask people how much it made them think about word length, but this was literally the number of characters in the words, which correlates extremely well with the fourth component. So one possible conjecture that one could make based on this is that, at least for these types of concrete nouns, perhaps some of the dominant factors that contribute to the neural representations for those 60 nouns correspond to these kinds of semantic features. All right. So now I want to switch a little. I mentioned at the beginning that we've been looking at this question with both fMRI and MEG more recently. So I want to point out that the wonderful thing about MEG is that it's fast. We can get an image per millisecond. We don't have to worry about bold response. The bad thing about MEG is instead of getting millimeter-sized resolution, you get golf ball-sized resolution. But yeah, I guess you have to give up something to get something. So we've been collecting data like the following. I want to show you a movie of the 550 milliseconds following the point at which this person observed the text HAND with a line drawing of a hand above it. So here's what happens in this person's brain. And over here you see the time clock. So we're starting at 20 milliseconds pre-stimulus. And here it goes. So this is the kind of data we get from MEG while somebody is comprehending a word, which takes about half a second. So you can see there's a lot of different stuff going on here. And with fMRI, we're not able to see any of that sequential structure in what's going on. So when you look at that, you're kind of struck that, well, maybe these different features are appearing at different times. Maybe they're being coded at different times. Is where and when in this 500 milliseconds are those features actually being coded by the neural activity? That's a question we got interested in. So here is a plot, again, of the first up to 0.6 of a second, so 600 milliseconds. And these different curves show in each of these selected regions, mostly parietal and occipital and more superior regions, the color of the border of the region here corresponds to the color of that plot. And that plot is showing us how much activation there is from MEG in those regions. But the interesting question, of course, is what information is being coded when in those regions. So what we'd really like is a plot here across time of how accurately can we decode from this region as a function of time, say, the word identity. And so that plot looks like this. And this is if this 90% is what we get if we use the entire brain. This black line is what we get if we use the union of these particular regions. But the important thing to point out here is that the decodability of the word semantics peaks out at around 400 milliseconds, even though the magnitude of the activation has died down quite a bit by then. In fact, if you go back to that movie, you see that most of the activity from MEG was well before 400 milliseconds. So it's not the case that where we see the greatest activation is where we're seeing the information coded. It's quite the opposite. So here's another way of looking at it. What I wanted to show you is we used these 218 mechanical Turk features. We added in another 11 perceptual type features because we were using line drawings with words. And so we made up just a simple set of perceptual features like, is the line drawing vertically oriented, or is it diagonal left, diagonal right? Is there a lot of internal structure in the line drawing, or is it pretty much just simple? Things like that. So very simple perceptual features. That gave us the 218 plus these 11, 229 features. Then we found that these were the regions in the cortical regions where those 229 features had a subset that were most decodable. And then we trained a classifier that on 50 millisecond windows moving forward in time. And so what I'm going to show you is what features are decoded when and where in each of these regions during that 500 milliseconds. So at 50 milliseconds, the answer is none of them. And at 100 milliseconds, these are features. So in occipital, the program can decode word length, right diagonalis, verticality, and in a couple other regions as well. At 150, it's this. By the way, I'm using lowercase to refer to the perceptual features and uppercase to refer to what we consider semantic features. So far it's all perceps. Oops, 200. So here's, is it hairy is our first semantic feature. Is it hollow? Is it an animal? Is it made of wood? Yellow isn't the best choice. The yellow one says, is it bigger than a car on top? And at the bottom it says, is it man-made? Was it ever alive? Is it manufactured? I like, does it have feelings? So that's it. That's the sequence of information out of those 229 features that are best decodable during the 550 milliseconds that it takes you to read and understand a word. So, and that's only a glimpse of it, right? We have that data for 229 features across time. This is these are the most decodable of the features in each of those regions. But you see that the point is that now we can start looking at the evolution over time of the appearance of these coded features. Here's another way of looking at that. So what I was showing you in the previous animation was the most decodable features at every window. But what if I just pick one of the features, let's say word length on top or alive on bottom, and I ask, at the 50 millisecond window that begins at 100 milliseconds and goes to 150, where are the weights that are used to try to decode word length? You see they're very occipital. And as we move forward in time, it basically just gives up. You can't decode it anymore. Whereas for alive, it's interesting. It starts out posterior, but as we go forward in time, it becomes more anterior. So you can see that even the coding of that information is kind of crawling around. Okay, so another way of kind of summarizing the result is ask, out of those 218 semantic features, which ones were most decodable at any time, at any place, across the whole brain. And here's the list. And interestingly, if you look at that list, you notice a number of those top features are really size. They're not the size of the line drawing. The line drawings covered the same angular distance for everybody. This is the real object size. The bee that we presented was the same size as the house we presented in terms of the line drawing, but this is the actual size. That's one theme you see. Another is manipulability. Animacy, is it alive? And maybe shelter. Can it keep you dry? Is it clothing? Does it open, and is it hollow? Might be related to shelter as well. So again, we're seeing these kind of themes emerge in terms of the factors or the components of meaning that are showing up in these decodings. Okay, so if you ask me at this point, if you could only have 5 features to use to decode word semantics, what would they be? If I had to guess, and they were concrete nouns like the ones we've been working with, I would say these 5, but I might be wrong. But based on the evidence we have, I think that's sort of our best hypothesis. But in fact, in terms of modeling, in the models that we're studying now, we just want to use as many features as we can. There's no harm in being over-complete in terms of your characterization of the semantics or the percepts in the stimulus. So it's very much an open question, but that's our partial result. So I want to end by just mentioning, sort of coming back to the top level and saying, if you think not just about this talk, but a number of the talks that we've heard here today and yesterday about where can the field move forward, I think this idea of coming up of using algorithms to devise intermediate features that can be related both to the stimuli that we're using and to the observed neural activity, so they become the mediators for mapping back and forth from stimuli to the neural activation, is actually a really interesting and important idea. And it's just really 5 years ago we didn't kind of have that idea, and now it's starting to emerge that there are several ways people have proposed of doing this. I think it's important. And one of the questions I hope we get to in the discussion period is, so what will we use these encodings for beyond what we're already doing? And I want to end by suggesting one thing that we might do is we might start to build computational models that operate off those learned encodings or those intermediate encodings. So for example, one question we're interested in language processing is, if I say to you bear, bear, and get their FMRI activation, then if I say to you hungry bear, what's the relationship between the neural coding for hungry, for bear, and for hungry bear, the phrase? How does your brain compose the meaning of these multiple symbol phrases? And using our initial model, we might give the word bear, get some semantic feature coding of it, predict the neural activity so we have some established correspondence for one of those words in the phrase. But if we have 2 words, want to build a model in the future where we give it an adjective and a noun, well, we know how to represent somehow what the noun means. We know how to represent, say, the co-occurrence statistics for the adjective too. And if we had a coding of that for the phrase, then we'd know how to predict it, because we can learn these coefficients from these 2 vectors. So a model for predicting adjective-noun neural representations for arbitrary adjective-noun phrases is going to need this missing component. One way to do it would be to come up with some function, that's our hypothesis, about how the code for these 2 words gets composed into the code for the phrase. And one of our students, Kai-Min Chang, did a first step of that, which he published in the Computational Linguistics Conference, where he simply took the simplest possible approach. He looked through the literature, linguistics literature, and two competing models were this vector should be the conjunction of the features here or the disjunction of them. And so he tried those out with FMRI data for the phrases. And so here you see the verb frequencies for soft and for bare. Here you see the codes for the noun phrase. If you just take the adjective, just take the noun, just take the sum of those soft and bare, or if you multiply them one by one. And in his model, he found that the multiplicative, the and, the conjunction of those features gave a better result than the other three models. So that's not to say that he solved the problem of how our brains put together words. But I want to put this up to kind of open up our thinking about what we might do now that we have algorithms for devising cross-subject abstractions of both the fMRI activity and the stimulus properties. Then these really could become the grist for a lot of interesting cognitive computational models. And I think this suggests the kind of approach one might go about. If I had to do this again, I'd use machine learning to learn that function instead of giving it two choices and stopping. So I'll just leave this up because I don't want to. I would love to set the precedent of not hearing that second bell. So I'll stop here and just leave up a list of things, of ideas about how we might use those representations going forward. Thanks.
So on the MEG data, I'm back here. So on the MEG data, where we were decoding the 20 questions words, is it big? Is it, can I hold it in my hand? It was interesting because I would have intuitively, just in the base of no information, I would have guessed that there would have been some sort of systematic pattern in time, like things that you could hold would occur earlier than is it hairy, for example, I don't know. And it seemed like it was kind of random. I mean, is there anything systematic in the kinds of things you can decode over time?
Nothing that we believe so strongly that we'd publish it, but it does seem that there are a lot of features associated with animacy that are early. Like, is it hairy might even be one of those. And several of the talks have led to a follow-up discussion about aren't your conclusions very sensitive to a particular set of stimuli that you're training on? And the answer in our case is yes, they are. And so it may be that is it hairy is just a synonym for is it alive relative to the stimulus set that we're using. But if we saw anything, I would say it's that maybe animacy is early. Gus, would you have anything to add to that? But we were surprised when we started this. We had little discussions where we were hoping, expecting that there'd be these kind of semantic features that would lead to those, that would lead to these. And what we found was not that really. It just kind of poof, they're all there.
Because it also seemed like the spatial distribution was kind of random, right? It wasn't, because another way you could think of this happening is the semantic, abstract semantic features that you can decode in the back of the head would occur first, and then the ones that require more anterior computation would occur later. But that also I didn't see that in the data you showed.
There were quite a few features in there that appeared first in posterior regions and then subsequently in more anterior. So like, I should have started earlier. Word length, for example, starts there. Well, I guess it's pretty much everywhere.
Oh, right. I was talking about the abstract features. Yeah, the concrete features, that kind of made sense.
Yeah, this one's kind of interesting.
I'd like to take issue with the claim that we don't have to worry if we have more degrees of freedom in the model than we do data. Because we absolutely have to worry, because you said something at the end where I think you put a caveat, which is that you have to put a significant regularization on the models, and that's effectively reducing the degrees of freedom in the model. So I think in fairness, we do have to worry about it.
That's fair.
Okay.
I worry about everything to different degrees. But fitting models with more parameters than data is not in my top 10 list of worries.
Okay, it's in my top 10, which is why I was taking issue.
Okay.
But that's
Well, if you care just about accuracy, your accuracy to classify, you wouldn't care, right? As long as it works. If you want to construct a model which you analyze deep inside, what those weights mean, right? That's when you want model not just which generalizes but has meaning inside. And there I would worry probably.
Okay, so I mean, the concern, of course, is the generalizability, right? So I can train any model with more degrees of freedom than data, but it's not going to generalize in any reasonable way. But your point is well taken, too, that the more parameters you have, the harder it is to analyze the interior of it. So, but I mean, my concern is the generalizability, right? Is how is this thing going to go to data that it hasn't seen before?
I see. So, yeah, I guess my response to that is, you know, honestly, cross-validation does not lie. So I don't care how you train the model. If I try it out on another data set and it does well, I'm going to believe it.
I agree, but that's because you put the regularization, right?
Yes.
Without the regularization, but that's important, right? Without
Oh,
that,
yeah. Using the right algorithm is important, including regularization. I was just pointing out that I disagree strongly with what I'll call conservative statistics that says you can't do this. In fact, you can and you must for the kind of models that we're talking about. So.
Yeah, I would second both of those points. I mean, you're effectively making you're putting a prior assumption which is hidden in the regularization in some way, which you could in another model make more explicit. So of course you can do it. It's a question of interpretation. Yeah. But my larger question was, I kind of lost track as to kind of where, you know, you started by showing brains and decoding, but you seem to end up with conclusions that, I don't know, to put a point on it, did I need brain imaging to get to your conclusions? So I'm missing what the brain was used for in these analyses.
Oh, I see. Well, let's see. So we were having fundamentally, we're talking about a model where a computational model where you give it a stimulus and it predicts the brain activity. So and that's what all the.
So you're using predicting the brain activity as a proxy goal as the goal of itself. That's the only reason we need the brain is a thing to predict, not to tell us about the underlying structure of language because again that could emerge without the brain. It seemed right. Is it just predicting brain activity as a goal in of itself is useful?
I see. Right. No. So the goal really is to understand, the long-term goal is to understand language processing. The nearer-term goal is to understand just the sub-question of how are neural representations of meaning related to the stimulus, like a word, that is the index into your meaning representation, right? And I think the main conclusion is the neural representations. So here are two alternatives that could have been true before we did this work. It could have been that there's a big hash function in your brain. Every word gets a different code, and there will be a different fMRI image for every word, but there won't be any systematicity there. But we know that's not true. We know that there is systematicity, in fact, so much systematicity, that if I just code that word in terms of 4 numbers, which I will informally call shelter, manipulation, edibility, and word length, then I can distinguish 80% of the time 2 new words that have not been in the training set but are still concrete nouns based on their 2 fMRI images. So it's not, so it's sort of, we are taking the idea that if we want to, here's the logic. If we want to understand the structure of neural representations of meaning, the best way I can think of doing it is to build a computational model that makes predictions, extrapolates beyond the stimulus that we've been able to give it for training, makes predictions for arbitrary new words, and then see whether it's right or wrong. If it's wrong, then we'll have to go back and change that model. So that's where the brain comes in.
So maybe a more psychological way of asking the question that Jim just asked is, what did you learn about language that you didn't suspect or didn't know before?
Yeah.
That's one. And then the second part of this question is, I was struck by just the broad activation of somatosensory cortex when you had associated actions and so on. It seems to me that it would be very interesting to do, take a corpus of words that have very strong visual associations versus very strong somatosensory, olfactory, all sorts of other associations, and make predictions on the more general categorical, spread of those things. So the first question is, from your
What do you really
experience,
learn about language?
What did you learn about language? I mean, I'm sure you learned some things that surprised you, and what were they?
Yeah, that's great. So let me answer the second one first, because it's easy. Yes, we should use more diverse data sets. And in fact, we just collected a 1,000-word data set, which is a lot easier to do with MEG than it is with FMRI, because your intertrial stimulus interval can be much faster. And so this model is all built on too small a diversity of words. So we're working on that. But back to your first question, what did we learn about language? It's, sadly little about how your brain comprehends words. What we learned instead is how the neural activity in your brain has substructure that can allow us to predict the spatial and perhaps temporal, but at least the spatial distribution of neural activity. So it's really, what we learned is more about meaning representation than it is about language comprehension. And I think I would say the same of Jim and Jack, if I had to guess. That they've learned more about meaning representation, or not meaning representation in some case, perceptual representations, and what they are and how they're structured, than about what are the steps the brain goes through to generate those patterns of neural activity. That's certainly true in our case, but my parsing is that it's the same for Jack and Jim.
Before I let them answer that, which they may want to do, I was, for once I was very strongly struck by, in your response, maybe this is exactly the thing to compare the brains of animals, monkeys, on versus humans. Even though it's a language test, you wouldn't present the words, but the associated pictures, and then with MEG analysis, see if those meanings are comprehended in the same way, to see if there is a unique element of human language here that you're getting out. Anyway, that's just a weird thought, but.
Yeah, I'd love to do this on monkeys.
I'm wondering about possible BMI applications. I mean, I think people usually do a BMI with motor cortex output, but this might be for a lot of tasks like a more natural and more distributed way of getting, intentions out.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. In fact, now that we have this model, we can set up as a well-defined algorithmic question, what are the 20 concrete nouns that our model would predict are most easily distinguished based on fMRI? And if you were going to do some kind of brain-computer interface, you might want to know what are the from an engineering point of view, what are the most separated out neural patterns that you can get. And then you might even tag buttons on some device by pictures of those 20 things. And, so I think from an engineering point of view, that's not an unreasonable thing to try.
What's kind of intriguing to me about your approach is that before becoming familiar with that, I thought of our problem as kind of having these two levels. One is the computational level, where people build models that process the stimuli and predict brain activity. And the other level is this semantic level, where we have predefined categories, but our models don't really tell us how the brain analyzes the stimuli, right? So that's, for example, the literature on the category selective regions. Now, it's very fascinating that I think the different people here are invading the explanatory gap between these two from different sides, right? And it's sort of interesting in the context of your work to think of what level it's at, because you have the sort of the question like, is it furry, right? It's sort of not easy to build a computational model that computes that, right? Of course, if you use a lot of statistical data, use the text corpus information, perhaps you can get to an approximation of it, but then the way you do that doesn't really model how the brain does it, right? So it's sort of an intermediate level where you're opening up all this complexity of semantic representations, making it more concrete and learning about it from the data. but there's still sort of the black boxes, so to speak, that are not very close to what the brain is doing, right?
Right. It's more of a model of what the representations are, not how they get computed in the brain. But again, I think that's equally true of the other work we've heard here. Or not all of the work, but I'm in particular interested. I think the closest analogy to what we're doing is what Jim was talking about this morning, combining data from multiple people to understand what substructure there is in the visual cortex neural patterns, and Jack's work on relating, movies to what structure there is in the representations. So I think all three of these are kind of in the same position, in the same awkward position, in terms of not really telling us how, but just telling us what those representations are.
Let Swaroop have the last question here.
So you did not explicitly say anything about the data from auditory stimuli, like say when people heard like words.
Oh, how many words?
Well, you said like people were presented with words as like texts and pictures and words, but you also said something about they heard the words, right? Like auditorily.
Oh, auditory, right. We have done some MEG work with auditory stimuli and just some very preliminary data. And
does the factor loadings looks very similar to like the text presentations, or?
Well, one thing that makes spoken language difficult is it takes hundreds of milliseconds to say refrigerator. So we don't know quite how to align these 50 millisecond time windows to the unfolding 300 millisecond utterance of refrigerator. So that's one of the difficulties. But we have started to collect MEG data for that. And actually what we found mostly was, actually Layla, who's here somewhere, there she is, came up with, I think, a really clever idea. She said, well, we don't know what the name of all the percepts are, but it wouldn't be nice to have a test of whether there's a perceptual feature here or whether there's a semantic feature here. And she came up with the following idea. Why don't we train everywhere in the brain 2 different classifiers? One of them will be for a pair of words, like let's say, we'll do it for every pair of words. We'll take, say, 60 words and train word pair classifiers for every pair of words. And we'll look at the mean accuracy there. And so then we'll get words like, hammer and house and hammer and screwdriver. And we'll just take the mean accuracy of all those individual word pair classifiers. Now, if you think about it, those classifiers could succeed either by decoding semantic features or perceptual features. And then we'll train a second set of classifiers that are about word categories, like tools versus buildings. And those can only generalize from hammer to screwdriver if they're actually using semantic features. So Layla's idea was, let's train both kinds of classifiers and then look for regions in the brain where one of those does better than the other and vice versa. And what we found was, with the visual line drawing stimuli, the place in the brain where the pair of words classifier did better than the categories was just occipital cortex. And in the auditory presentation, it just moved right over to near auditory cortex, was the only region where you got stronger, substantially stronger accuracy decoding word pairs. So, sorry for the long-winded answer, but so we're just starting to kind of poke around with this, with auditory stuff. But